The only way I think that this can be not really understood, but maybe felt, maybe grasped, is, if we imagine that your child goes to school one day and doesn't come back, and then after all the searching, the worry, the wonder, you find out that, oh, the child was taken away on a ship. And on the other side of the ocean was either died in a wreck or was thrown over or whatever. Well, certainly just to know that and to know that, okay, well, this is the site where it happened, I think that gives us the perspective on what sites like this really do mean.
December 19th, 1827. A seasoned band of pirates watched daybreak over the Bahamas. Their journey began 4,000 miles ago. Now, with just 250 miles to Santa Cruz, Cuba, they were almost home free. Captain Jose Gomez and his crew aboard the Spanish slave ship Guerrero would soon deliver their cargo of 561 West African prisoners to the slave auctions in Cuba and leave with pockets full of gold and silver. As noon approached, their fortunes turned. They had plotted a course through the Florida Straits in order to avoid British patrols, but suddenly, on the horizon, a warship stood between them and their destination. Gomez ordered his crew to raise full sail, but it was too late. The warship fired 2 warning shots. Gomez knew the chase was on. The 2 ships raced west through the Florida Straits, but Gomez wasn't worried. The Guerrero was heavily armed, and its copper-plated hull made it one of the fastest ships money could buy, faster than any British warship. But the warship steadily closed the gap on the Guerrero. What Gomez didn't know was that this vessel, the HBM Nimble, was once the slave ship Bolivar, a smaller vessel that outmatched the Guerrero's speed. The weather turned bad. Heavy swells and squalls pounded both ships. At dusk, the Nimble caught the Guerrero. A firefight erupted. Night fell over the ocean as the battling ships drifted toward Carysfort Reef in the treacherous waters of the Florida Keys. Captain Gomez devised a plan. He knew the British followed strict naval protocol, so he held up a lantern to signal the Guerrero surrender. When the Nimble ceased fire, Gomez ordered his crew to hoist the sails, making a last-ditch effort to save his prized cargo. 15 minutes later, his escape attempt failed. The Guerrero struck the reef with such force that the hull tore open and both masts broke. 41 African prisoners were killed in the wreck.
There were screams that crossed 2 miles of ocean that the warship men heard.
Gail Swanson began researching the story of the Guerrero 12 years ago while supporting herself working odd jobs in the Florida Keys. Discovering the story of the Guerrero has led her to other finds, including a lost African cemetery at Higgs Beach in Key West. Several years ago, she sold her home on Grassy Key and moved to Central Florida. She's living off the equity in order to research full-time. Her money runs out this year.
As I was going through the materials, I kept coming across articles by Gail Swanson, and I finally asked, well, who is this Gail Swanson? I need to get in touch with this lady. Well, she works at the Home Depot in Marathon. And I said, well, okay, this is my kind of people. This is not somebody associated with a university or a newspaper.
With the Guerrero wrecked, the Nimble's captain, Lieutenant Edward Holland, knew he had to act fast to save his ship and crew from the same fate. Holland ordered his men to change the sails, but moments later he heard the gut-wrenching sound of his own hull dragging along the reef. His crew threw ballast and cannonballs overboard to lighten the ship, but the powerful waves snapped the anchor line and pushed the Nimble further onto the reef. As the tide went out, the Nimble was left stranded for the night, 6 miles from the shore.
You can imagine the captain's thinking at the time that his duty, Lieutenant Edward Holland's duty, was to save the people on the slave ship from a lifetime of slavery in the Cuban fields. In doing that, he accidentally ran them to their doom in the waters off Key Largo, Florida, and he could do nothing to assist them. His ship could not sail.
We're talking about 41 people. Millions were lost. But if we can take those 41, we can focus on smaller range disasters because our brains can wrap around that. But the enormity of the whole thing, it becomes surreal. And so it loses its significance in the way that we're able to digest it in our minds.
There was no group of people really responsible for this. You couldn't say that the English or the French or the Dutch or the Spanish or the Arabs or the Jews or the Africans or the white or the black. This moral decision was something that was made by individuals.
Denizulu Gene Tenney has devoted his life to helping others understand the impacts of the slave trade on the world today. Through his art, writing, and community activism, he's brought many pieces of lost history to light, including the renovation of the once segregated Virginia Beach in Miami and the planned full-scale replica of the slave ship named Dos Amigos Fair Rosamond.
The term Middle Passage, we use it all the time, is preferable to the term slave trade because A, these were not slaves, these were people. We call this a slave trade. Well, to call burning villages, murdering, capturing people, selling them, to call that trade in any legitimate sense doesn't, really work. Once it became illegal, you just had kind of a wide open scene where slave trading and piracy and all of these things kind of worked together, and the line between them, just wasn't that clear.
In 1827, Key West was the only colonial settlement in Florida south of St. Augustine. Its economy was based on the business of wrecking or saving wrecked ships from the reef. On the morning of December 20th, 2 wreckers and a fisherman anchored in the Upper Keys awoke to an incredible sight. The stranded warship Nimble and the ruined Guerrero on its side, its hull filled with water, and nearly 600 Africans and Spanish crew hanging from the rigging, struggling to stay alive. The wrecker Captain Grover and his men arrived on scene and began the rescue. Soon, survivors filled the deck of the fishing boat and the captain set sail for Key West. Grover and Lieutenant Holland then loaded Guerrero Captain Gomez, most of his crew, and many of the remaining Africans onto Grover's wrecker. Anticipating Gomez's ruthlessness, Holland ordered all weapons thrown overboard and requested Grover anchor his ship beside the Nimble for protection. As night fell, the tension thickened. When the wrecking crew entered the cabin for dinner, Gomez seized the opportunity. His men cut the anchor line. Grover rushed from the cabin, but he was too late. Gomez had control of the Thorn. The pirate crew hoisted the sails of their new ship and headed for Cuba. In their wake, gunfire from the Nimble fell helplessly into the sea.
In the murder mysteries, you need a body, you need a corpus delicti, and we really need that shipwreck, and we need to prove that it was there and where it happened.
Brenda Lasendorf works as the lead archaeologist and cultural resource manager for Biscayne National Park. Most believe the Guerrero lies along the boundary of the park and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. Brenda is enthusiastic at the prospect of finding the wreck site within her waters and is actively assisting with the search.
In the case of the Guerrero, there is no doubt plenty of material down there that would enhance our understanding of life on board that vessel's larger role in the regional sort of history.
There's no positive way of saying where it's at, but this general area, South Pacific Reef, is where it surely, in my estimation, is at.
After I learned of the story of the Guerrero, the first dive I made back in that general area was a very different feeling for me. All of a sudden, it became a very emotional experience for me. I started looking at the sites that I had been monitoring for years in a different light. I literally went home the first dive I made after I had heard of the Guerrero story and had nightmares about what it must have been like that day for the individuals on board that vessel.
The morning after the hijacking, Lieutenant Holland had the remaining 12 Spaniards put in irons and brought aboard the Nimble. He then sent the third wrecking ship to Key West with the remaining 122 African survivors. During the 100-mile journey, one more African would die. When the wrecker docked at Key West, there were no other Guerrero survivors to be found. The fishing boat had never arrived. 4 days later, it finally pulled into port along with Captain Grover's wrecker. Neither ship had Africans on board. The fishing crew explained that they had been hijacked as well, and their African survivors, along with those from the Thorn, had been taken to Santa Cruz, Cuba, and marched into the countryside to join the other 286,000 Africans already enslaved there.
Wreckers and salvors were pretty suspect as a group. I mean, they had gained a reputation for being pretty predatory and just, waiting for something bad to happen, almost encouraging bad things to happen if they could.
The wreckers knew that once they got the slaves to Key West, they were going to get nothing out of them. These were human beings, and they were going to get nothing. There was suspicion in the judge's mind, and I've seen it. I just can't lay my hand on it. He was suspicious that they for the greenback dollar, they took these people to Cuba and sold them or got a reward. And we don't know, really. We just do not know that they didn't get a reward.
Warship Nimble, now seaworthy and docked in Key West, Lieutenant Edward Holland faced a new crisis, losing a British warship over salvage fees. The wreckers sought payment for saving lives and for pulling the Nimble off the reef, and the U.S. Collector of Customs demanded payment for the equipment salvaged from the Guerrero. Because of the notorious collusion between the wreckers and Key West, Holland pulled anchor on the Nimble and sailed off, leaving the wreckers without so much as a dime, and leaving the Africans in the hands of the Americans. By now, the Africans who landed in Key West had been through capture, internment in African slave camps, a pirate raid at sea, a 4,000-mile journey in a disease-ridden hold, a fierce gun battle, and a violent shipwreck. Now stranded in Key West, they faced political limbo in a land where they could communicate with no one. At the time, Key West had only 500 residents, and the influx of 121 new guests was difficult for the town to cope with. The customs collector placed the local deputy marshal in charge of the Africans and provided what funds he could for clothing, blankets, and provisions. Within days, word reached the Key Westers that someone, possibly Captain Gomez, was arming a ship in Havana to raid the town and retrieve the lost portion of his human cargo. Fear gripped the island. The locals took immediate action and set up cannons in the streets. The militia was called out and put on 24-hour watch, waiting for the attack. The Spanish raid never came to Key West, but over the next 3 months, the local deputy marshal faced numerous threats and bribes from people trying to take possession of the Africans. Unable to ensure their safety, he turned to Florida's federal marshal in St. Augustine, Waters Smith. Smith realized the urgency of the situation, but when he arrived in Key West, the scene was more disturbing than he had anticipated. 6 more Africans had died. Others were blind from diseases of the hold, and many were ill. Waters Smith chartered a ship and took the Africans to St. Augustine, where he provided them with food, clothing, and medical attention. Since it was an emergency situation and he could not obtain timely government approval, he spent $3,000 of his own money, more than $100,000 by today's standards, to ensure their well-being. The fate of the Guerrero survivors hinged on a decision from the highest levels of government. The anti-slave trade laws did not apply to them because they had landed accidentally on American shores and were not purposely imported. Resolving their situation would require an act of Congress. Meanwhile, officials in Washington refused to reimburse Waters Smith and mandated he rent the Africans to plantations in order to provide them with food and shelter until a final decision was made regarding their fate. Some were placed on the Kingsley and Hernandez plantations, where they faced hard labor alongside many other slaves. 3 escaped to live within the wild frontier lands of northern Florida. Others were not so fortunate and died in plantation fields near St. Augustine and Jacksonville.
It's important that this site is found, the people are honored that lost their lives, but that this site also acts as a reminder that we have to be vigilant to make sure that a monster like slavery or indenturedness or sharecropping does not ever raise its ugly head again.
The National Association of Black Scuba Divers, or NABS for short, has several thousand members in more than 30 chapters across North America and the Caribbean. Members of the organization are hoping to start their own search for the Guerrero.
Blacks are not known for their being involved in the aquatic environment, swimming, and that type of thing. And I think most of the black divers that you meet always think that they were the only ones on the boat, or the only ones that thought they did this, but found out there were not. And there's lots of us that do this. The education of the Guerrero, the Henrietta Marie, will maybe, hopefully, let the new youth know that, you know, your forefathers, your ancestors gave their lives, fought for their lives, your lives, for you could be here so you could live free.
Today is the type of day out here where you wouldn't think that this has ever happened. It's the ocean and the water out here is a great mask to hide its history and its true face. The opportunity to go down and actually visit the site or help try to find the site, excavate a site, is going to be very important.
We've got a great relationship with the National Association of Black Scuba Divers. They have been very supportive, and they put a plaque down on the site, and we sort of helped them make that happen, although they did all of the major part of the work.
The Henrietta Marie wreck that was found off Key West, needless to say, of all the artifacts that came out of there, I mean, when people saw actual shackles, those of us who ever took an interest saw pictures of shackles in books, but to actually see them, and then to see little ones, I mean, I considered myself pretty big and tough, but I have to tell you, the sight of that, it lets you know that, yeah, we've got some learning to do,
I'm British, in fact, and lived in Britain for the first 21 years of my life. And when we found this ship, I was so hoping that it was going to be, a French ship, because that would have been so much easier to deal with. But in fact, it's a British ship, and it sailed from London, and that's where I was born. So although one doesn't like to think about it, it's pretty obvious when you just even vaguely think about it that some of your ancestors were involved in the slave trade.
People tend to forget through the years, people tend to forget where we come from and what prices have been paid to get people to where they are today. People have a lot more freedoms now than we've probably ever had. Not just African American people, but really all people. And that's something that needs to be remembered, because our youth today, I think a lot of problems with our youth right now is they're not educated. The past is like, that never happened. That was somebody else. That didn't have anything to do with me.
Knowing about that stuff is really not important in our generation. But me personally, I think the past is who you are. Because without the past, then where would you be? I think we take advantage of a lot of things. We should know what our ancestors went through and shouldn't take so much stuff for granted. Yeah.
Is America better served as a nation if the next generation of Americans doesn't think about this, doesn't have to acknowledge that there were lynchings? I have, in sessions with school teachers, I've thrown out the question semi-facetiously, are we prepared to teach the next generation that Nat Turner was a national hero? Well, people sort of laugh and kind of, do the nervous laughter thing, but then you stop and think, well, now, George Washington fought for freedom. He used violent means. He's a national hero. We're not trying to prescribe anything. It's just, let's not educate or miseducate our young people to be dumb. Let's not make ignorance fashionable. Throw it out there, November 11th, we honor all those people who fought for freedom. It's Veterans Day. November 11th, I learned recently, is the date that Nat Turner was hanged. Is that significant to our history or not? Do we sweep it under the rug? What happens is, if we allow the history of the past to be swept under the rug, then what about the history of the present?
March 1829, a year after the Guerrero survivors were rented into slavery on the plantations of northern Florida, President John Quincy Adams successfully lobbied Congress to pass an act concerning their future.
He really seemed to have had a passion that something should be done to help these people. And things were getting in their way, and he was going to open the door so that they could be taken care of.
And you know, a lot of scholars of John Quincy Adams have no idea anything about this. I've been through a lot of his biographies. They say in relation to African Americans, you know, the Amistad is where it started. Amistad was 12 years later.
The Guerrero survivors would be returned to Africa, not to their homelands for fear of re-enslavement, but to the newly established colony of Liberia.
Liberia was kind of a mixed blessing, you might say, or a project that had mixed emotions. On the one hand, you had kind of a promised land where enslaved people here in America could actually return to Africa, return with some of the skills that they learned, return with Christianity, and you know, some degree of scientific knowledge, because in many cases, the people who were interested in migrating there were people who had sort of higher aspirations and maybe, you know, acquired some useful knowledge on that level. On the other hand, it was also viewed as the solution to America's Negro problem.
The government wheels moved slowly, but by September, Watersmith was given permission to collect the Africans for their journey home. He hired Native Americans to track down the 3 runaways and gathered them along with the other Guerrero survivors on Amelia Island. They waited the arrival of the schooner Washington's barge. But when the ship came into view, it never stopped. Unknown to Watersmith, it had a charter to drop off other passengers in St. Augustine.
And they watched this ship went by, sailed right by them, and it didn't come back for 3 weeks because of adverse winds.
Finally, Washington's barge was ready to leave for Africa. 2 of the Africans were not allowed on board because they had contracted the infectious disease yaws. 1 would soon die from the affliction.
Oh, death, just bear me over another year. Death, have mercy.
On September 30th, 1829, Watersmith watched the remaining Guerrero survivors board Washington's barge and leave America as free men. But it soon became clear that the captain of Washington's barge was ignorant to the proper route across the Atlantic. The ship was also unseaworthy, and storms plagued the journey. After fighting the trade winds for 89 days, they made port in Barbados. By then, 9 more Africans had died.
How long would it normally take to go from North Florida to Liberia, just in a sailing ship?
Back in that time, it would probably taken them anywhere from 3 to 4.5 weeks, depending on the weather.
They left North Florida in September. They arrived in Liberia the following March. That's how long, and that's why we have more deaths.
When inspectors declared the vessel unfit to sail, the governor of Barbados guaranteed another ship, and they continued their voyage to freedom. On March 6, 1830, nearly 3 years after being forced from their homeland, the remaining Guerrero survivors stepped off a boat in Africa. 1 year later, John, the last African who was held back due to Yaw's disease, arrived in Liberia.
A child who is conceived in an act of violence is destined to live kind of a troubled life. I mean, this child is going to know himself or herself to be part of divine creation on the one hand, but the problematic ways in which you got here are going to haunt you, especially if other kids are cruel enough to taunt you about it. And I suggested that America is that kind of child. I mean, here is a country, a society that was built on the precepts of Indian removal and African enslavement. That's a lot of baggage to carry. But I think that lack of inner peace stalks us and haunts us every day. Can the Guerrero help to alleviate that? I think so. I think so in the same way that the Amistad story does it, the Henrietta Marie story does it, the Dos Amigos story that I'm working on. And it goes back to what you said earlier. The tangible artifact, the verifiable truth, this is no longer something abstract. Here in this water, in this place, on the coast of Florida, this happened. When Gail Swanson brought that story to light, that this African burial ground was on Higgs Beach. Higgs Beach, this is where you go to the beach, to chill, to swim, to relax. And now you have to confront the fact that 294 people are buried here. Well, does that shock and disgust you, or does it just say, maybe it's time to grow up and be adults and get out of dreamland and understand this is the country we're living in. The way we got here is problematical, but we are part of a divine plan, and we do mean to be here, and we're going to take this gift of life and make it all that it can be, on a higher level.
The ones that were taken to Cuba, I couldn't relate with because I knew I'd never find them. It was illegal to import people. There's not going to be records. But the ones that remained in the United States, which was 121 people, for about a year, I just went around and I felt like I had 121 people with me all the time because I had found them in the archives. And I just couldn't ignore them after that. So that's why I continued with work to find out everything I possibly could about their lives after that. It was my responsibility as a person.
I'm gonna sail like a ship on the ocean. I'm gonna sail like a ship on the ocean. I'm gonna sail like a ship on the ocean. On the ocean. I'm gonna see.
I have several men that I have traced all the way to happy lives with families in Liberia instead of being human cargo in the hold of a Guerrero. This was possible because they gave them American given names and wrote those names down when they arrived at Liberia so I could follow their lives further. I've done everything except for go to Liberia myself over these people, and I can't not do that because of the political situation there.
Where we recognize that every one of us is capable of the highest achievements that people have ever done, and capable of the lowest crimes. We don't, we don't scratch our heads and wonder, well, how could people do this? People did it. Now, the question is, who are we, and what are we prepared to do?